The heavy, cut crystal glass in my father's hand caught the ballroom light, casting a jagged, blood-red fracture across the white linen of the head table. He didn't just hold the drink, he brandished it like a scepter. I stood 3 paces behind him, my spine a rigid line of Marine Corps cordite and muscle, my dress blues pressed to a razor's edge. I was a lieutenant colonel with 2 bronze stars and 18 years of grit under my belt, but to Arthur Caldwell, I was nothing more than a convenient punchline for the Richmond elite. My daughter, Irene, has spent nearly 2 decades perfecting the art of disappearing, he said, his voice booming with that practiced, judicial resonance that had terrified me as a child. He turned to the crowd of silver-haired donors and judges, a slow, condescending smirk spreading across his face. While the rest of us were building legacies and navigating the complexities of the law, Irene decided to hide in a uniform. She's had a front-row seat to history and somehow managed to contribute absolutely nothing to it. The laughter didn't ripple, it crashed. A wave of polite, cruel amusement from people who had never seen a sunrise through the smoke of a burning triage tent. Beside him, my sister Claire looked at her salad, her knuckles white. I didn't flinch, I didn't let my gaze waver. I simply tracked the room, my pulse a steady, tactical 60 BPM, recording the faces of every person who found my life's work a joke. I was a ghost in a room full of mirrors, and they had no idea that the nothing my father mocked was the only reason the guest of honor's son was still breathing. At the center table, Judge Harrison Miller stopped mid-laugh. He wasn't looking at my father. He was staring at the small, jagged scar on my jawline, a souvenir from a mortar fragment in Kandahar. He looked from the scar to the medals on my chest, and the color slowly drained from his face. He knew. He was the only one in that room who understood that when the world stopped being polite and started being bloody, I was the one who held the line. Arthur leaned back, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder, his thumb digging into the wool of my rank insignia. "But don't worry," he added, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to the back of the hall. "She's home now. We're going to find her something simple to do, maybe something involving a desk and a quiet corner where she can't get into too much trouble." I felt the heat of the validation gap blooming in my chest, a cold, focused pressure. I looked at the glass of scotch in his hand, then directly into his eyes. He thought he was introducing a failure to his peers. He had no idea he was actually handing the keys to his kingdom to the woman who had already bought his debt. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for me, it was a deployment. I leaned in, my voice a low, clinical rasp that only he could hear. "Enjoy the drink, Arthur. It's the last one you'll ever have on my tab." The silence that followed my whispered ultimatum to Arthur wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, ionized air right before a lightning strike. My father's hand, still resting on my shoulder, twitched. I felt the tremors of his fingers through the wool of my tunic, a microscopic betrayal of the iron composure he'd spent 40 years perfecting. He didn't pull away immediately. To the room, it still looked like a father bestowing a patronizing blessing. To me, it felt like a drowning man clutching a piece of jagged slate. I stepped out from under his touch with a deliberate, slow grace. I didn't look back to see his expression. I didn't need to. I knew the exact shade of crimson that would be creeping up his neck, the way his jaw would set into that rigid, litigious line. Instead, I focused on the exit. The ballroom of the Jefferson Hotel felt smaller now, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and the cloying, sweet rot of too many lilies. Every step I took away from the head table felt like shed skin. My boots made no sound on the thick, cream-colored carpet, but in my head, I heard the rhythmic crunch of gravel and the distant, low thrum of a hovering bird. "Irene," the voice was thin, frantic. I stopped near a pair of towering marble pillars. Claire was there, her silk dress shimmering like oil on water. She looked small against the grandiosity of the room, her eyes darting back toward the podium where Arthur was now attempting to salvage the moment with a strained, hollow joke about military intensity. "You can't just say things like that to him," she hissed, her fingers twisting the strap of her clutch. "Not here, not in front of the Landons. Julian's father is watching us, Irene. They're looking for any reason to pull the funding for the merger." I looked at my sister, really looked at her. I saw the way her mascara was just slightly smudged at the corners, a casualty of a morning spent crying over seating charts, or more likely, over the man she was being traded to. The merger is a ghost, Claire, I said. My voice was flat, the tone I used when explaining a non-viable prognosis to a medic. And Arthur is the one haunting it. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. You've been gone, you don't know what it's been like here. The house, the ridge, it's all tied to this. If this dinner fails, we lose everything. I reached out and tucked a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. Her skin was cold. We lost everything a long time ago, Claire. We just haven't finished the paperwork yet. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I could feel the weight of Judge Miller's gaze on my back, a silent, burning question I wasn't ready to answer. Outside, the Richmond air was a humid punch to the lungs. The late summer heat clung to the brickwork, smelling of exhaust and river water. I walked past the line of idling town cars and gleaming German SUVs, their drivers leaning against fenders, scrolling through phones, oblivious to the quiet war happening inside the gold-leafed walls. I found my truck at the far end of the valet lot. It was a 2018 Tacoma, scarred by salt and grit, an ugly, functional beast parked among the thoroughbreds. I climbed into the cab and sat there in the dark, the leather of the seat hot against my back. I didn't start the engine. I just sat. The silence of the cab was different. It was the silence of the cockpit before a night extraction. I looked at my hands in the dim glow of the street lamps. They were steady. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, battered metal tin. Inside was a St. Christopher medal, not the one I'd given Silas Miller, but its twin. It had belonged to our mother. I remembered her holding it in the garden of Caldwell Ridge, her fingers stained with North Carolina red clay, her eyes always looking toward the horizon, as if she were waiting for a storm that never quite arrived. She had been the first casualty of Arthur's legacy, not through violence, but through a slow, systematic erosion of her will. He'd turned her into a ghost long before she finally stopped breathing. I squeezed the metal until the edges bit into my palm. Arthur thought I'd been hiding for 18 years. He thought the uniform was a cloak for a woman who couldn't handle the complexities of his world. He didn't realize that the military hadn't hidden me. It had forged me. It had given me the one thing he could never buy, the ability to see a wound for what it actually is, not what the patient wants it to be. The Caldwell estate was a necrotic limb. It was black and festering under a silk bandage of gala dinners and legal prestige. Arthur was the primary infection, and he was trying to spread it to Claire. I turned the key. The engine turned over with a low, guttural growl that felt like a confirmation. I wasn't going back to the ridge to pack. I was going back to open the red folders Claire had mentioned in her panic. I was going to find the LM Associates wire transfers. If Arthur wanted to play at being a titan of the law, he was about to find out what happens when you try to cross-examine a woman who has spent her life staring into the eyes of death and refused to blink. As I pulled out of the hotel lot, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. The shadow of the scar on my jaw looked darker in the moonlight. "I'm not hiding anymore, Arthur," I whispered to the empty cab. The drive toward the mountain was long, the road winding through shadows of pine and oak. Every mile was a release of the spring. I wasn't the lost soul. I was the one holding the scalpel, and the first incision was going to be the deepest. The drive to Caldwell Ridge was 25 miles of ink-black pavement, and the rhythmic, hypnotic flicker of pine trees in the high beams. By the time I pulled the Tacoma into the circular gravel drive, the adrenaline from the gala had cooled into something heavier, a cold, dense layer of resolve. The house sat atop the rise like a mausoleum of white stone and glass, its windows dark except for the amber glow of the porch light. I didn't go into the main house. I couldn't stomach the smell of Arthur's humidor or the sterile, museum-like quiet of the foyer. I headed for the guest cottage, a small stone building tucked behind the oak grove where the air always smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Inside, I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the room by feel, my hands finding the edge of the desk, the weight of the laptop, the familiar texture of the rough-hewn floorboards. I sat down, the screen's glow throwing my reflection against the dark window, a pale, tired ghost with a jagged shadow across her jaw. I needed to see my file. I needed to know exactly how much of my life Arthur had managed to redact. I logged into the VA portal. My fingers moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 mission reports. I hit the final authorization key. Access denied, administrative hold. I stared at the red text. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. My record wasn't just classified, it was locked behind a civilian legal firewall. I tried the secondary personnel server. Same result. Contact legal liaison, Caldwell and Associates. Arthur hadn't just mocked my service, he had quarantined it. He was treating my career like a dirty secret he could keep in a basement safe. He needed me to be a lost soul, because a decorated surgeon didn't fit the narrative of a man who needed to seize his daughter's trust to pay for his scotch. I leaned back, the compressed spring of my heart rate ticking up. 70, 75. I thought back to the triage tent, the sound of the rain hitting the canvas like 1,000 small drums. The smell of the earth after a mortar strike, that sharp, metallic ozone. I remembered Silas Miller's blood on my boots, warm and slick. I had lived a lifetime in those moments, and Arthur was trying to delete them with a keystroke. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. I didn't reach for a weapon, but my body went into a low-crawl tension anyway. It was Claire. She looked even smaller now, wrapped in an oversized cardigan that probably belonged to our mother. She was holding a heavy, crimson-colored accordion folder against her chest like a shield. "He's still at the hotel," she whispered, stepping into the dim light of the laptop screen. "He's drinking with Julian's father. They're celebrating." I didn't ask what they were celebrating. I didn't have to, I just looked at the folder. "What's that, Claire?" I found them in the floor safe in his study. He forgot to spin the dial after he left for the gala. She set the folder on the desk. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. I started looking for the wedding deposits. I thought maybe he was just being difficult, but it's not just the wedding, Irene. I opened the folder. The first page was a foreclosure notice for Caldwell Ridge. The second was a notice of default on the firm's trust accounts. "He's hollowed it out," I said. My voice was a low rasp, stripped of any emotion. I was reading the bones of a dying estate. "There's more," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Look at the wire transfers, page 12. I flipped through the bank statements. Huge sums, $200,000, $450,000, moved from my mother's legacy trust into an offshore account labeled LM Associates. I checked the dates. They were chronological markers of my trauma. One transfer was dated the day of the Kandahar breach. Another was the week I spent in Landstuhl getting the shrapnel pulled from my jaw. While I was bleeding out, Arthur was draining the accounts, using my unavailability to bypass the joint signatures. "He told the bank you were mentally incapacitated," Claire whispered. A sob broke her voice. "He said you were suffering from severe, combat-related instability. He used your Bronze Star as proof that you weren't fit to handle your own inheritance." I looked at my hands. They were perfectly steady. The validation gap wasn't just a difference of opinion anymore. It was a crime scene. Arthur had taken my sacrifice, the very things that had nearly broken me, and used them as the leverage to rob me. He had turned my service into his personal slush fund. "Does Julian know?" I asked. Claire looked away. The silence was my answer. Julian Landon didn't just know. His family was the LM in the Associates. The Landons weren't merging with us. They were absorbing the remains of a carcass Arthur had already butchered. "Irene, what are we going to do?" Claire's eyes were wide, looking at me for the strength I'd spent 18 years trying to pretend I didn't have. I didn't answer right away. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, hard edge of the St. Christopher medal. I looked at the red text on my laptop screen, access denied. "Go to bed, Claire," I said quietly. "Lock your door." "But, go." She left, a ghost fading into the shadows of the oak grove. I turned back to the screen. I wasn't the lost soul. I wasn't the unstable vet Arthur wanted the world to see. I was the commanding officer of a salvage operation. I began to type, my fingers moving with a cold, surgical precision. If Arthur wanted to play at being a titan of the law, he was about to find out that some debts aren't settled in a courtroom. They're settled in the dark, by the people who know exactly where the pressure points are. I wasn't just going to find the cracks in his mirror. I was going to be the hammer that shattered it. The silence of Caldwell Ridge was never empty. It was a pressurized void, filled with the ghosts of who we were supposed to be. After Claire left the guest house, I stayed in the shadows of the desk, the crimson folder feeling like a live wire in my lap. I needed more than just bank statements. I needed the architecture of the lie. I stepped out into the night. The air was turning, a sharp, pre-dawn chill cutting through the Virginia humidity. I moved toward the main house, my footsteps silent, a habit from the flight line where noise meant a lapse in situational awareness. I didn't use the front door. I went through the mudroom, the smell of Arthur's expensive leather boots and cedar-scented jackets hitting me like a physical barrier. I headed for the attic stairs. The attic was a graveyard of Caldwell excellence. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight piercing through the circular eaves, illuminating stacks of leather-bound law journals and trophies from Arthur's polo years. It was a museum of a man who lived for the applause of people he didn't even like. In the far corner, tucked behind a moth-eaten velvet curtain, sat my mother's roll-top desk. It was the only piece of furniture in the house that didn't smell of lemon wax and arrogance. It smelled of dried lavender and old earth. I sat at the desk. My knees hit the underside where I used to hide during Arthur's character-building rages. I felt for the catch. A small, wooden notch near the back of the drawer, a secret my mother had shared with me the day before I shipped out for my first tour. The panel clicked open, revealing a gardening journal. But it wasn't a record of roses and hydrangeas. Tucked into the back was a thin, black ledger. As I flipped through the pages, my breath hitched. My mother had been a meticulous record keeper. She had tracked Arthur's aesthetic fraud for decades. The quiet loans taken out against the family's mountain retreat to pay for country club memberships. The gifts to judges that were never recorded. She had seen the rot coming before the rest of us even knew how to spell it. On the final page, written in her hurried, elegant hand just weeks before she died, was a single bank account number and a small, rusted key. For Irene, for the choices I didn't have. I pulled up the account on my phone, routing through a secure military VPN. It wasn't just a savings account. It was a multi-million-dollar trust, funded by her family's textile wealth and protected by a legal firewall Arthur couldn't penetrate without my physical signature. I sat there in the dark, the key cold against my palm. The validation gap had just inverted. Arthur wasn't just my father, he was a man living in a house built on a foundation I now owned. He thought he was erasing me, but he was actually just building a cage on a plot of land I held the deed to. He had spent 18 years calling me useless, while I was the only person with the capital to keep his world from collapsing. I heard the heavy thud of the front door downstairs. Arthur was home. I didn't rush. I tucked the ledger and the key into the pocket of my sweatshirt. I moved back down the stairs, catching a glimpse of him through the banister. He was leaning against the mahogany sideboard in the dining room, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand. He looked older than he had at the gala. The Titan of the Law mask was slipping, revealing a man who was terrified of his own shadow. I could have confronted him then. I could have walked down those stairs and handed him the ledger. But I'd learned in the field that you don't initiate a strike until you've mapped the entire perimeter. I slipped out the back door and returned to the guest house. The morning light was beginning to bleed over the ridge, turning the sky a bruised, hazy purple. I looked at the rusted key, one last time before sliding it under my mattress. Arthur had spent 30 years trying to make me feel small. He'd used my trauma as a weapon to steal my mother's legacy. He thought he was the one holding the strings. He was wrong, he wasn't the strategist, he was just the target. I closed my eyes for the first time in 48 hours. The compressed spring of my anger finally settling into a steady, cold resolve. The war for Caldwell Ridge had officially moved from the shadows to the front line, and I was the only one who knew where the mines were buried. The following Tuesday, the air at Caldwell Ridge carried the first sharp bite of a Virginia autumn. It was a clean, thin cold that cut through the lingering humidity of the valley. I spent the morning on the wraparound porch, the space where my mother used to sit and watch the shadows stretch across the Blue Ridge. I was working on my old Flight Medic shears. The sharpening stone made a rhythmic scritch-scritch sound, a grounding frequency that kept my hypervigilance from redlining. My hands moved with a mechanical memory. 18 years of keeping steel sharp and heart rate steady had made these movements an anchor. Arthur was inside the house, probably rehearsing a closing argument in front of a mirror. He emerged around noon, his silk tie knotted with a mathematical precision that signaled he was ready to be seen. He didn't look at me. He looked at the long, winding driveway, checking his gold watch with a twitchy, nervous energy. "Someone's coming," he said, not as a conversation, but as a command to be ready. I didn't answer. I just kept my eyes on the steel of the shears. A black government sedan crunched up the gravel drive. It was an unassuming car, the kind that whispered power rather than shouting it. Arthur straightened his jacket, his Titan of the Law mask snapping into place. He beamed as the passenger door opened, a sound like a dry branch snapping. "Harrison, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Arthur's voice was a practiced symphony of warmth. "Come to discuss the land use litigation over lunch? I have the files in the study." Judge Harrison Miller stepped out of the car. He looked older in the daylight, his face etched with the kind of deep, vertical lines that only come from a life spent weighing the heavy, messy souls of men. He didn't look at the house. He didn't look at Arthur's outstretched hand. He walked past my father, his gaze fixed on the porch. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at me. I stood up, the shears still in my right hand, the sharpening stone in my left. My heart rate sat at a steady 60 BPM. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the dry oaks. "Colonel Caldwell," Miller said. His voice was like grinding stones, rough and ancient. "My son, Silas, is back in the States. He's walking again. He's even talking about returning to the academy." Arthur's hand remained suspended in the empty air, a useless, pale appendage. He looked between us, his mouth slightly open, the validation gap finally becoming a physical chasm he couldn't bridge. "He told me about the St. Christopher medal," the judge continued. He stepped up one riser, his eyes searching mine. "He said he remembers the smell of jet fuel and the sound of the rain hitting the tent. But mostly, he remembers your hands. He said you never let go of his artery, even when the mortar fire was close enough to blow the surgical lights." I didn't smile, I didn't boast. I just nodded once, the movement small and professional. "I did my job, Judge," I said. My voice was a low rasp, steady as a heartbeat. "You did more than your job, Irene," Miller replied. He finally turned to look at Arthur, and the expression on his face was one of profound, icy clarity. "You gave me my lineage back. I spent 40 years looking for a hero in a courtroom, Arthur. Turns out she was living under your roof while you were busy telling everyone she was a lost soul." Arthur's face went through a terrifying transformation, from a sickly, pale gray to a deep, bruised purple. The compressed spring of my internal world rattled. He had spent 18 years trying to make me invisible, but in one sentence, the most powerful legal mind in the state had revealed me as a giant. "Harrison, Arthur started, his voice thin and reedy. "I'm not here for you, Arthur," Miller cut him off. He turned back to me. "Silas wants to see you. But more importantly, if there is anything you need in this town, you call my private chambers. Do you understand? Your father might not see the value of what you've done, but I do." The judge didn't stay for lunch. He didn't even stay for water. He got back in his car and left, the gravel dust settling back onto the driveway in the silence that followed. Arthur turned to me. His eyes were wide, vibrating with a mixture of terror and calculating malice. He didn't ask how Silas was. He didn't ask about the medal. He didn't even ask about the mortar fire. "What did you tell him?" he hissed, stepping onto the porch, his face inches from mine. "What kind of stories are you telling behind my back to destroy my reputation?" I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the desperate, hollow man beneath the silk suit. He wasn't a titan. He was a scavenger. "I didn't have to tell him anything, Arthur," I said quietly. I went back to my chair and picked up the sharpening stone. "He already knew the truth. You're the only one who doesn't." I began to sharpen the shears again. Scritch, scritch. The sound filled the space between us, a countdown he didn't know had already begun. The war for Caldwell Ridge had moved from the shadows to the front line. And for the first time, my father realized he was the one without any cover. The dining room of Caldwell Ridge felt like a pressurized chamber. The chandelier overhead cast a jagged, amber light across the sterling silver and bone china, making every reflection look like a blade. We sat in a theater of unspoken hostilities. I could feel the compressed spring in my chest groaning under the weight of the silence. Across from me sat Julian Landon. He was the quintessential scion of a Virginia legal dynasty, hair swept back with mathematical precision, teeth a shade of white that looked synthetic, and eyes that possessed the predatory stillness of a man who had never been told no. Beside him, my sister Claire was a ghost of her former self. The sunshine child had been eclipsed. Every time Julian's hand moved near hers, she didn't flinch, she went perfectly still. It was the tactical freeze of a soldier who knew they were trapped in a kill zone. Arthur sat at the head of the table, drinking heavily. The scotch had deepened the crimson in his cheeks, and his Titan of the Law mask was beginning to sweat. "Julian's father and I have finalized the merger details," Arthur announced, his voice booming to fill the cracks in his composure. "It's a new era for the Caldwell name, consolidating assets, streamlining the legacy." "It's more than a merger, Arthur," Julian said, his voice smooth as oil. He didn't look at my father, he looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a rescue mission. Your father has been overextended. My family is stepping in to ensure the Caldwells don't become a footnote in the public record." I watched Claire. Julian's hand covered her wrist, his thumb pressing down on the delicate bone. She didn't look up from her salmon. I felt a cold, familiar rage beginning to settle. I thought back to the red folder in the guest house and the wire transfers I'd mapped out. The conflict. I began a tactical reconnaissance of the conversation, peeling back the layers of Julian's condescension. The mystery of LM Associates wasn't about a business partnership. It was a ransom. The twist, as I watched the way Julian looked at my father, with a mixture of pity and ownership, the truth finally clicked into place. Arthur hadn't just lost money. He had been caught in a catastrophic act of malpractice a decade ago, and the Landons held the paper. The merger was a forced takeover. Claire wasn't getting a wedding. She was being traded as the collateral bride to buy Arthur's freedom from a federal prison sentence. "Julian is being very generous," Claire whispered, her voice so thin it barely reached across the table. I looked at Arthur. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was a man who had deserted his post, selling his youngest daughter into a lifetime of subservience to a predator just to keep his legacy from being exposed as a fraud. "Generosity usually has a price," I said. My voice was a low, steady rasp that cut through the clink of silverware. Julian's eyes narrowed. "Irene, you've been away so long, you've forgotten how things work in the real world. Here, we honor our debts." "I haven't forgotten anything, Julian," I replied, my pulse sitting at a rhythmic 60 BPM. "I've spent 18 years seeing exactly what happens to people who can't pay what they owe." I looked at the silver-cent Christopher medal in my pocket. The validation gap was no longer just about my father's lies, it was a blood feud. Arthur was willing to let Claire be hollowed out from the inside to save his own skin. He didn't see a daughter across the table, he saw a payment. I stood up before the main course was finished. The movement was slow, deliberate. "Irene, where are you going?" Arthur snapped, the alcohol making his voice ragged. "I have some logistics to handle," I said. I walked out of the room, leaving the sterile elite world behind. I headed straight for the guest house. The compressed spring was no longer just a metaphor. It was a weapon I was preparing to fire. I knew now that I couldn't just heal the wound at Caldwell Ridge. I had to amputate the rot. Arthur had been selling his family to a man who looked at us like livestock, and I was the only one in the world with the capital and the grit to stop the sale. The war had shifted. It wasn't about an apology anymore. It was about a rescue, and I was the only one left on the front line. The air in the guest house was cold, smelling of old paper and the sharp ozone of my laptop. While the main house slept, I operated. I moved with the clinical, detached efficiency of a surgeon in a mass casualty event. There is a specific rhythm to high-stakes logistics. You identify the bleeding, you clamp the artery, and you don't stop until the vitals stabilize. I was no longer the lost soul Arthur tried to bury. I was a logistics commander. I reached out to a contact in the Pentagon, a man whose daughter's life I'd saved in the back of a burning Humvee outside Fallujah. "I need a tactical buyout," I told him over an encrypted line, my voice a low, steady rasp. "Total anonymity. Move every cent of the Caldwell debt to a shadow LLC. I want to be the one holding the paper by dawn." "That's a lot of weight, Irene," he said, his voice crackling with the distance. "I've carried heavier," I replied. For 36 hours, I didn't sleep. I survived on black coffee and adrenaline, the compressed spring in my chest fueling a cold, focused rage. I watched the digital counters on my screen as I systematically triaged the estate. I used the multi-million-dollar trust my mother had hidden, the one Arthur never thought I'd find, to buy up the predatory liens Julian's father had placed on the ridge. The action, my fingers flew across the keys, a mechanical percussion in the quiet room. I mapped the Landon firm's holdings. I saw where they'd over-leveraged themselves. I saw the greed. It's always the same with men like Julian and his father. They assume their targets are too broken to fight back. The twist, as the final transfer cleared at 0300, the true depth of Arthur's betrayal hit me. I stared at a digitized deed I'd just acquired. Arthur hadn't just mortgaged the house. He had secretly sold the mineral rights of the mountain to a strip mining conglomerate. He was planning to let the land be hollowed out from the inside, leaving the family a shell while he retreated to a condo in Richmond. He was selling the earth beneath our feet. But there was a deeper rot. In my dive into the Landon firm's private ledgers, I found the malpractice bone. I leaned back, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. The irony was a bitter taste in the back of my throat. It wasn't Arthur who had committed the crime a decade ago. It was Julian's father. Arthur had been the fall guy, blackmailed into believing he was the guilty one because he was too drunk, too arrogant, and too terrified to check the original filings himself. Julian's father had framed him, then offered to save him by taking his daughter and his land. Arthur had been selling Claire to a man who had orchestrated his ruin. I looked out the window as the first gray light hit the mountain ridge. The triage operation was complete. The debt was no longer a chain around my family's neck. It was a leash in my hand. I reached into my pocket and felt the St. Christopher medal. The silver was warm against my thumb. Arthur had spent 18 years telling the town I was a lost soul, a woman who had done nothing. He was about to find out that nothing included learning how to dismantle an enemy's supply chain while they were still sleeping. I wasn't just Arthur's daughter anymore. By sunrise, I was his landlord, his primary creditor, and the only person on earth who knew he was being played for a fool by the man he called a partner. I closed the laptop. The compressed spring was ready to let go. Now it was time for the kinetic release. The humidity of the Virginia afternoon hung like a wet wool blanket over the garage of Caldwell Ridge. I was deep in the bowels of my old truck, the smell of motor oil and oxidized iron acting as a familiar sanctuary. Here, the world made sense, mechanical, predictable, and honest. You turn the wrench, the bolt moves. You bleed the lines, the pressure returns. Arthur appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. He wasn't wearing his legal armor today. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he held a stack of papers with a grip that turned his knuckles white. "You're done, Irene," he snarled, his voice losing the polished resonance of the courtroom. "I've filed the petition with the county clerk. By Monday, you'll be under mandatory observation at the Greystone facility. I'm doing this for your own good. You're unstable, and your outbursts at the gala proved it." The compressed spring within me let out a high, metallic whine. My heart rate climbed to 90 BPM. The ghost sound of a mortar whistle rang in my ears, a phantom warning of incoming fire. I wiped my hands on a grease-stained rag and stepped toward him. My movements were fluid, tactical. I didn't rush. I closed the distance until I could see the broken capillaries in his nose. "You're overreaching, Arthur," I said. My voice was a low, dangerous rasp. "You're trying to bury me to keep your own rot from being exposed." "I'm protecting the legacy," he roared, his face flushing a deep, mottled purple. Suddenly, the air seemed to leave him. His eyes went wide, his hand flying to his chest as he gasped for a breath that wouldn't come. The stack of papers scattered across the concrete floor. The forged psych evaluation, the lies, the nothing he had labeled me with. He collapsed against the grill of his Mercedes, sliding down the silver star until he hit the floor with a sickening thud. Every instinct I had, the 18 years of hiding he'd mocked, took over. I didn't think, I operated. I dropped to my knees. My medical shears cut through his $400 silk shirt in one clean stroke. I checked his carotid. Weak, thready, he was in VFib. "Claire, call 911. I yelled toward the house. My voice was the same one I'd used to command a triage deck. I began compressions. The rhythmic thump crack of his ribs was a grim percussion. I ignored the sound. I ignored the sweat stinging my eyes. I was back in the tent, the floor slick with Silas Miller's blood, the world shrinking down to the 4 inches of space between my palms and a dying man's heart. As I worked to keep his blood moving, a letter fell from his inner breast pocket. It landed face up on the oily concrete, right next to my knee. The twist, it was a signed agreement with Julian's father. It wasn't a merger, it was an exile agreement. Arthur had agreed to commit me to a private facility, indefinitely in exchange for the Landon firm absorbing his personal gambling debts. Debts I hadn't even found yet. He wasn't just trying to discredit me. He was selling my freedom to save his reputation. I looked at his pale, sweating face as I breathed life back into his lungs. I was saving the man who was actively trying to bury me. My hands didn't shake. I kept the rhythm. 1, 2, 3. The debt of justice was no longer just a feeling. It was a formal declaration of war, written in the very blood I was forcing through his heart. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, a rising scream that matched the tension in the garage. I leaned down close to his ear, my voice barely a whisper over the sound of his struggling heart. "Stay with me, Arthur. You aren't leaving this world until you see exactly what I've done to yours." The EMTs burst through the door, but I didn't move until they were ready to swap. I stood up, my hands stained with his sweat and the grease of the truck. I picked up the exile agreement from the floor. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my pocket, right next to the St. Christopher medal. Arthur was breathing, but his world was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. The lakeside chapel was a masterpiece of artificial perfection. White hydrangeas lined the aisles like frozen, silent clouds. Ceiling fans spun lazily against the thick, stagnant heat of a Virginia summer, humming a low drone that sat in the back of my skull like a migraine. I stood in the vestibule, adjusting the cuff of my navy dress. No medals today, no dress blues. I didn't need the uniform to be the person I was. I felt the weight of the leather-bound folder in my left hand and the cold, silver edge of the St. Christopher medal in my right pocket. Arthur stood at the altar, looking robust and triumphant. He had turned his heart episode into a campaign of fatherly resilience. He looked like a king reclaiming a throne he'd almost lost. Beside him, Claire moved like a clockwork doll. Her veil was a white shroud, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the lake. At the reception hall afterward, the air was a cloying mixture of grilled steak and expensive lilies. The Richmond elite shifted and mingled, their laughter the sound of dry leaves skittering over pavement. Julian Landon stood at the center of it all, his hand possessively on Claire's waist. He looked at me across the room and smirked. It was the look of a man who thought he'd already won. Arthur stood for the toast. He tapped a silver spoon against a crystal flute, the sound sharp and demanding. "To a merger that secures our legacy," he beamed, his voice carrying that practiced, judicial warmth. "To family and the strength it takes to make the hard choices for those we love." I stood up. The room didn't just go quiet, the gravity shifted. I felt 200 pairs of eyes lock onto me. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I simply walked to the head table, my heels clicking a slow, tactical rhythm on the polished wood. I placed the leather folder directly in front of my father. "The merger is canceled, Arthur," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, clinical weight of a battlefield command. It cut through the clinking of silverware like a razor. "Irene, sit down," Arthur hissed, his smile faltering but not yet breaking. "You're making a scene. You're tired." "I'm not tired," I said, my heart rate sitting at a rhythmic 60 BPM. "And I'm not making a scene, I'm settling the accounts." Julian Landon stood up, his face darkening. "Now see here, Irene. I'm the primary creditor for Landon and Miller," I interrupted, my gaze never leaving my father's eyes. "I purchased the Caldwell debt 48 hours ago. I own the ridge, I own the firm, and I own the malpractice evidence you've been using to blackmail my father." I turned the folder around. I laid out the exile agreement Arthur had signed, the one where he traded my freedom for his gambling debts. The gasps were audible, a collective intake of breath that stripped the room of its oxygen. I saw the validation gap close with a physical, crushing force. Arthur wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a man in a borrowed suit standing in a room he no longer owned. At that moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. Staff Sergeant Silas Miller entered in full dress blues. His chest was heavy with medals, his gait steady and strong. He wasn't the broken boy I'd held together in a triage tent anymore. He was a living testament to the nothing I had done. He was followed by a detachment of Marines in perfect formation, their brass gleaming in the candlelight. They didn't look at the wealthy donors. They didn't look at the legal legends. They marched straight to me. Silas snapped a sharp, bone-cracking salute that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Colonel Caldwell," he said, his voice a steady roar. My father, the judge, sends his regards, and I'm here to stand watch for the woman who never let go." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a sector that had finally been cleared. I looked at Arthur. He looked small. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. "The reception is over," I said to the room. I turned and walked out. I didn't look back to see the fallout. I didn't need to. I had been a ghost in their world for 18 years. Now they were the ones who had vanished. I stepped out into the humid night, the compressed spring, finally, violently, still. The silence of Caldwell Ridge was no longer pressurized. It was hollow. The sterile world of the Richmond elite had folded like a cardboard set after a final performance, leaving behind a ringing quiet that sat in the back of my throat. There were no caterers to clear the half-eaten steak, no string quartets to drown out the sound of a family coming apart. 3 days after the wedding, I found Arthur in the garage. He was sitting on a rusted metal stool in the center of the bay, bathed in the low, amber light of a dying Virginia afternoon. He was still wearing his tuxedo trousers, but the jacket was gone, and his white shirt was stained with grease and sweat, a map of his sudden descent. He was staring at his hands. Soft, manicured hands that had never held a wrench or a suture needle. He looked like a man trying to remember how to breathe without an audience. "You had the money all along," he whispered. His voice was a dry husk, stripped of its judicial resonance. "You let me twist in the wind. You let me believe I was drowning." I stood by the workbench, my fingers tracing the cold, serrated edge of my Flightmedic shears. I didn't feel the heat of the compressed spring anymore. The tension had been replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. "I didn't let you drown, Arthur," I said. My voice was a low, steady rasp. "I watched you choose your own rescue. I watched you sign a document to have me committed so you could keep a car and a club membership. I just stopped providing the air. We didn't have a cinematic reconciliation. There was no weeping, no 'I love you,' no sudden realization of paternal warmth. Instead, there was something far more rare in the Caldwell bloodline: honesty. He admitted it then, his voice cracked with exhausted defeat. He had buried my records because he couldn't stand the reflection. Every time I came home with a new rank or a medal, it reminded him that his legacy was built on paper and prestige, while mine was built on blood and bone. He was a man who talked about the law, while I was a woman who enforced life. He tried to make me invisible to keep himself from feeling small. "The Landons are gone," I said, handing him a glass of water, not scotch. "The debt is settled. I've secured the ridge for Claire and the firm will be restructured. But the terms have changed. You're a tenant here now, Arthur. You'll live in the guest house. You'll have a stipend, but you will never hold a pen or a person's future in your hands again." I watched him take a sip of the water. His hand shook. The validation gap had been bridged by the raw, ugly truth. He wasn't a titan. He wasn't a king. He was an old man sitting in a garage he no longer owned, facing a daughter he had never bothered to know. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I just felt the weight of the years, the deployments, the silence, the swallowed anger, finally settling into a foundation. "I saved your life in this garage, Arthur," I said, looking at the oily spot on the concrete where he'd collapsed. "And then I saved your reputation at the lake. That's the last of the nothing I'm ever doing for you." I turned and walked out into the cool evening air. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I headed toward the farmhouse, the smell of damp pine and wood smoke rising from the valley. The sector was clear. The triage was over. For the first time in 36 years, I wasn't waiting for a command. I was the one giving it. It is late autumn in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the air has finally turned. The heavy, suffocating humidity of the summer has been replaced by a crisp, biting cold that smells of fallen pine needles and wood smoke. At Grandma Lorraine's old farmhouse, the one piece of the estate I refused to let Arthur touch, the leaves on the oaks have turned a deep, violent red. They drift onto the wraparound porch where I now spend my mornings, watching the mist settle into the valley like a cooling shroud. The validation gap has been closed. Not by a grand apology or a cinematic embrace, but by the steady, unyielding passage of time. I sit in the rocker, my mother's gardening journal resting in my lap. I am no longer wearing the service dress blues. I am wearing an old Marine Corps sweatshirt and jeans, my hands calloused from a month spent repairing the stone walls of the property. The silver cent, Christopher medal is no longer in my pocket. I've pinned it to the inside of the journal, a silent sentry over her secrets. Claire is still married to Julian, but the power dynamic has suffered a tectonic shift. With the Landon firm's malpractice evidence held in a secure digital vault under my control, Julian has become a very attentive, very quiet husband. Claire is no longer the sunshine child. She is the CFO of the restructured Caldwell Holdings. She's finally learned that sweetness is no substitute for a primary interest. She visits on Sundays, and we talk about the future, not the past. Arthur stays in the guest house. He's become a man of small domestic habits. We speak on Saturdays, short, awkward conversations about the weather or the harvest. He is a man learning the weight of silence. I see him through the window sometimes, staring at the mountains. For the first time in 36 years, I don't feel the need to prove that I am standing there. I don't need his pride to anchor my existence. My phone buzzed this morning. A formal offer from the regional hospital to head their new trauma wing. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel a need to show the letter to Arthur or demand his recognition. I simply looked at my hands. The useless hands that had saved Sela's Miller, that had kept Arthur's heart beating in a greasy garage, and that had quietly dismantled a legal empire. The compressed spring is still. The debt of justice has been paid in full, not with revenge but with boundaries. I am Irene Caldwell. I am a surgeon. I am a soldier. And as the sun dips below the ridge, casting long, peaceful shadows across the fields, I realize that I am finally, fundamentally, home. I breathe in the cold mountain air. It is the long exhale of a woman who has stopped passing the pain forward. The story didn't end with a victory, it ended with the truth. And the truth is the only thing quiet enough to let me finally sleep. I closed the journal, stood up, and walked inside. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see in the dark. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the restoration of a life, not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. In the end, the weight of a person's worth isn't determined by the volume of their voice or the height of the pedestal they build for themselves. It is measured in the quiet, consistent reality of their actions when no one is watching, and in the lives they hold together when everything else falls apart. We spend so much of our time chasing the shadows of approval, forgetting that the only validation that truly holds air is the kind we forge in the fire of our own integrity. True strength is rarely loud. It doesn't need to diminish others to feel tall, and it doesn't require a title to carry authority. It is found in the hands that heal, the minds that plan, and the hearts that choose mercy over the easy heat of revenge. When we look at the people around us, we often see only the roles they play or the labels we've pinned to them, ignoring the hidden scars and the hard-won wisdom that define their true depth. But the world has a way of testing the foundations we build. When the sterile illusions of status and prestige eventually crumble, and they always do, only the raw, honest truth remains standing. Resilience is about more than just surviving. It's about refusing to let old wounds dictate the shape of your future. It's the courage to set a boundary where there was once only a bruise, and the wisdom to understand that you cannot fix a foundation built on sand. Sometimes, the greatest act of justice isn't a strike, but a quiet turning away, a decision to stop passing the pain forward and to start building something that can finally survive the winter. We are all, in some way, walking each other home through the dark. The least we can do is respect the weight of the burdens we cannot see. I want to thank you for spending your time with me today. Stories like this remind us that while words can wound for decades, the truth, spoken clearly and lived with dignity, is the only thing that can truly begin the healing. If this story touched a chord in your own life, or if it reminded you of a moment where you had to find your own voice, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds a necessary layer to these tales of resilience. If you found value in this journey, please consider following and subscribing to the channel. We share new stories of human depth and quiet justice every week, and having you as part of this community means the world. Let's keep walking each other home, one honest story at a time.